from the people of the seminar.
Okay. From the students.
From the students, exactly. This is Agustin, by the way. Agustin is my colleague, the other teacher of the seminar.
Nice to meet you.
Bueno, como se dan cuenta, vamos a tener esta reunión en inglés. Robin, this is just, do you understand a bit of Spanish in case someone wants to make a question in Spanish?
Yes, I do, so that's not a problem. Yeah.
Okay, great. Bueno, estamos transmitiendo ya en YouTube, por lo que entiendo, así que, bueno, esta es la actividad de cierre de un seminario de posgrado de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, que dimos con Agustín Pestifilippo. El título del seminario era Teorías críticas contemporáneas de las justicias, diálogos, problemas filosófico-políticos. Y bueno, como actividad de cierre vamos a tener una pequeña conversación con Robin Celikates, que voy a pasarlo a introducir así rápidamente. Robin es actualmente profesor de Filosofía Social y Antropología en la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Es director adjunto del Centro de las Humanidades y el Cambio Social en la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín e integra el equipo editorial de Critical Times, Interventions in Global Critical Theory. Es autor de Kritik als soziale Praxis, Gesellschaftliche Selbstständigung und kritische Theorie, y autor junto a Rael Jaegui, otra autora que estuvimos discutiendo durante el seminario, de Social Philosophie, Einführung. Bueno, su actual trabajo, de esto nos va a hablar un poco ahora, supongo, se centra en la teoría crítica, la desobediencia civil, la democracia, la migración y la ciudadanía, y pensábamos un poco que por todos estos intereses que tiene y por su más amplio contacto con la tradición de la teoría crítica, era esta una buena ocasión para charlar con él sobre el problema de la teoría crítica en sí, de la tradición y sus vínculos con el problema de la justicia, que fue, si se quiere, el problema articulador de nuestro seminario. Así que bueno, paso a darle la palabra a Robin, si les parece. Robin, I finished with the introduction, so maybe you can start with your presentation about your work and etc.
Yes, that's great. So thanks so much for the invitation to Santiago and Agustin. I spent some time in Buenos Aires a very long time ago when I was an exchange student at the Colegio Goethe. And I have very good memories of that time, but it's been a long time ago. So my Spanish is rusty, but I do understand enough, I think. So please feel free to ask your questions in Spanish later. So I'm gonna share my screen if Santiago or Agustin, if you could enable that. I can show a brief.
Yes, I think it's possible.
At the moment, it's not yet possible. It says host disabled screen sharing. It's also not super necessary, but yeah, now it should work.
Now?
Yeah, now it should work. Yeah.
Okay.
So I hope you can see the screen now.
Perfect.
Yes. Yeah, so I thought I'd just talk a bit about some of the issues in critical theory that have motivated me to write the book, but also some time ago as well, but also that still concern me. And these issues are partly methodological. I'm very much interested in how critical theory can redeem its commitment to be grounded in practice and to also be aimed at practice. But this is more complicated than it might at first sight seem. And I'm especially interested in how critical theory can relate to actual practices of critique, of resistance in the real world, and also what kind of epistemic resources it can find in these practices. So hence the title of the brief presentation I'm going to give today. I have 4 short steps. Don't worry, it's not going to be too long. I'm just going to have a few reminders about what this idea about the specifically critical relation between theory and practice amounts to. I will talk a bit about the possibly anti-emancipatory effects of critical theory itself, so that it can itself be involved in power relations and have power effects, as it were, on the practice it's supposed to be connected to. Third, I'll talk a bit about alternative standpoints and the tradition of standpoint epistemology and why I think it's relevant for critical theory, and then there's a brief conclusion. So as you know, the methodological debates in critical theory in recent years have been very much focused on the normative foundations of critique. So the questions where the criteria for critique come from. Broadly, there have been these three alternative proposals. There's the idea of internal critique. The criteria just come from the context that you criticize, and you sort of measure that context according to the norms it already recognizes. That's a kind of Michael Walzer style of critique, where you hold up the mirror and say, well, in your constitution it says, you know, I don't know, everyone is equal, but then look at reality, it doesn't really live up to that ideal. The second one is immanent critique. So that's the Hornetian idea, essentially, that you somehow reconstruct the normative structures of society, and that gives you a more complex procedure of critique, because you're not limited to the norms as they are already recognized in society, but rather it's a more interpretive and reconstructive approach. And a third, there's the more, let's say, traditional kind of ideal theoretical external forms of critique that we know from contemporary Rawlsianism, where you sort of, to put it briefly, develop a set of philosophically justified, for example, principles of justice, and then you can apply them to a variety of contexts. And I think that debate has been very important and relevant, and there has been a lot of back and forth. Obviously, the camps are still existing. You have the more hermeneutical camp, you have the more Hegelian camp, you have the more Kantian camp. You read some of the authors from the context of the Frankfurt School. So, you know, Rahel Yegi and Rainer Forst have been debating this for a long time. And there are the mutual accusations of, you know, that's relativist, that's crypto-normativist, that's normativist idealism, and so on. And I think while this is an interesting debate, it has also obscured some of the more fundamental questions, maybe, that concern the methodology of critical theory, such as the ones that were at the center of the early Frankfurt School. Think of the, you know, writings from the late 20s and early 30s from Max Horkheimer, and also from Adorno and others, Marcuse, where the relation between critical theory and practice was central. Obviously, that's a legacy of Marxism as well. And the idea that what distinguishes critical theory is that it's not a self-sufficient theoretical enterprise, but it's linked to practice in two ways. On the one hand, it's grounded in practice, and it's self-conscious about that grounding in practice. So it has to somehow situate its own point of view in the socio-political context in which it develops. But it's also aiming at practice. It has an emancipatory aim, as it is often put. And that emancipatory aim means that it has to somehow, again, be connected to the social struggles and movements of its time. But that relationship between critical theory and practice has become quite difficult to actually explicate once you neither subscribe to the traditional view that the theory is independent from practice, nor to the orthodox Marxist view that somehow you already have the, let's say, right kind of struggle or the right kind of movement that you can identify on the basis of your social theory or of your philosophy of history, and then you just attach, to put it simply, the theory to that. So once you don't have that belief anymore that there's one particular struggle that you can single out, the whole problem of linking theory and practice becomes more complicated. And I think these complications can be formulated in three kinds of fundamental challenges that critical theory has to face if it wants to maintain that commitment of relating theory of practice. And the first challenge is that there's no automatic translation here. So yes, you do have sort of different social positions, and you do have certain experiences that those in a position of domination, for example, might make. you have a potential transformation of those experiences into a kind of critical or oppositional consciousness, and that oppositional consciousness can become the basis or the driving force of practices of critique and resistance. But none of these steps is automatic. So the process can basically be blocked at each of these steps, right? It's not a guarantee that a socially positioned subject, be it a worker or a woman or a subject of racial oppression, somehow experiences that form of oppression in a specific way. And even if they experience their oppression in a specific way, there's no guarantee that this generates a critical consciousness. And even if there's a critical consciousness, there's no guarantee that this leads to the right kind of practice in a way. So it's a complicated process in which critical theory has to be able to sort of diagnose what can go wrong at each of these single steps. Second, what I think is characteristic of critical theory, that it's somehow standing in a tension that is irresolvable between two commitments. I think that that's a good thing maybe about critical theory. I think it's a tension that you can't really dissolve, but it's still a challenge of how to deal with it. The tension between, on the one hand, being committed to what I call here the fact of critique. So the social world is one that is traversed by social struggles and by contradictions and by the existence of critique on the ground. So people don't just accept the world they live in, but they have always questioned it, rebelled against it, etc. And that's an anchoring point that critical theory needs. It cannot be completely freewheeling, as it were. But on the other hand, critical theory is haunted by what Raymond Boyce called the nightmare of critical theory. So that we live, to put it in Adorno's word, in a totally administered society where each individual is so integrated into the machinery that there is no critical consciousness left, that there's no space for critique, that we all have become little wheels in the machine. That's a kind of tension, I think, that is characteristic for a lot of critical theory. And finally, even if you think that there are always social struggles and social movements and forms of resistance, they are, if you don't believe in the kind of traditional Marxist framework anymore, characterized by an irreducible plurality, and they are potentially at least cross-cutting or at cross purposes. So there's neither a clear historical hierarchy so that you can say, well, this movement is the most important one, and then the others are kind of, side contradictions, not the main contradiction, as some Marxists would put it when they talk about, anti-racist or feminist struggles. They say, well, yeah, of course they're important, but they're not as important as class struggle. That has become more problematic, I think, as a claim. But neither can we just assume that all these movements somehow magically converge, that there's kind of, in the end, a process where they move in the same direction. So I think it's important to keep these challenges in mind and to sort of not repress them. So to come back to this second challenge that I just talked about, I think this can be explicated a bit more by looking at what happens when critical theory places too much emphasis on the diagnosis of structural restrictions. So on the one hand, I think it's really the core task of critical theory to analyze and to criticize the obstacles and the structural restrictions that social reality imposes on the ability of agents to have certain experiences, to articulate those experiences, to develop critical consciousness, and to participate in practice of critique and resistance. That's why I think of critical theory as a kind of second order or meta form of critique. It's interested in the obstacles of critique and in making critique possible, as it were. But at the same time, this diagnosis and critique of those structural obstacles can itself have disempowering or anti-emancipatory effects. And we see that very clearly, I think, in the work of some critical theorists, from Louis Althusser or Herbert Marcuse to some contemporary theorists, where the agents are portrayed as being so restricted in their cognitive or critical abilities that the theorist herself becomes the only instance of truth, as it were, and that itself, as a lot of authors from Jacques Rancière to many others have argued, is a kind of anti-emancipatory effect that one has to be careful about. This has been criticized from a lot of different angles. I'm not going to go through all this. We can discuss it if you want in the discussion later. But from hermeneutics via post-colonial critics to the kind of Latourian, Boltanski turn to the agents themselves, I think this is something that these critics have pointed out in critical theory. But I think there's then still the question: well, what do we do with these criticisms of critical theory? Do we just abandon the project, as some of the authors here suggest, or do we try to integrate part of that critique into a reorientation of critical theory? And I think it's important to go down the second route and to take this critique of critique as an impetus for further self-reflection and also for the transformation of critical theory. And after all, it was one of the principles that was supposed to distinguish critical from traditional theory, that critical theory is self-reflexive about its effects. So I think these criticisms have to be taken seriously, but they shouldn't lead us to abandon the project of critical theory. Well, how could critical theory reorient itself? I think one route I've become interested in is by looking also at alternative theoretical traditions. And I think there are two insights that critical theory can take, for example, from critical race theory and standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology is a broad label. Of course, there's also a feminist tradition, but the authors that I'm referring to here are primarily working in the critical philosophy of race. And there are two important lessons from, let's say, social epistemology more broadly, and from the standpoint theoretical tradition more specifically, that I want to highlight. The first is a kind of socio-epistemological lesson, namely that societies are not epistemically homogeneous, where all the subjects are situated in the same epistemic way, but rather they're epistemically fragmented, and different positions afford different types of, or are subject to different types of group-specific epistemic constraints and possibilities. So to just talk about ideology, for example, is a problematic way of analyzing social reproduction, because it underestimates the fragmentation of the socio-epistemological space. The second lesson is a bit more concrete and maybe even more important. It's a kind of historical sociological lesson, namely one that especially feminists and anti-racist theorists have been emphasizing, namely that the epistemic constraints in many cases primarily negatively affect epistemic subjects who are members of dominant groups, while members of dominated groups can, so again, there's no automatism here, can turn out to be epistemically privileged with regard to an adequate understanding of social relations of domination because of the position that they occupy. Now, to make that a bit more concrete, I don't know how familiar you are with these authors, but someone like W.E.B. Du Bois analyzes this in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, in terms of the kind of ambivalent epistemic effects of structural racism. On the one hand, he talks about double consciousness as something that Black Americans experience because of racist discrimination. So a lack of self-trust, maybe a lack of epistemic self-trust even. But at the same time, he says that this creates a certain epistemic possibility or opening, because you have to navigate, as he says, two worlds. You have to navigate the white world, as he calls it, out there, with all the risks and pitfalls that it holds for you. And you know that this is not the whole truth or not the whole world, that you see the world through two perspectives, your own perspective, but also through that of the dominant group, in that case, white Americans. And that gives you a different epistemic framework than that of members of the dominant group who tend to only see through the hegemonic worldview that they share. To put it very briefly, obviously, it's a much more complex argument in the end. Patricia Hill Collins makes a similar claim with regard to what she calls the outsider within status of Black women in the US. By the way, you can also think of Georg Simmel, one of the main figures of German sociology. He wrote a famous article on the stranger and makes exactly the same point. Yeah, the stranger is basically a sociologist, has to be a sociologist, because he or she comes to a different context and has to figure out what's going on, whereas for most others, they are socialized into that context. They don't have to think about it. And Jose Medina talks about the same phenomenon in terms of meta-lucidity. So that just means that certain types of subjects have to be more aware than others in navigating the social world. As I said, there's no automatism, so it's not as if somehow magically the oppressed have, a clearer view of social reality, but it's a potential, and it's one that critical theory can make use of. And the second thing to see is that it's not a kind of relativist or subjectivist or particularist position, but one that is actually criticizing the lack of objectivity in hegemonic viewpoints by showing that these are often representations of a particular perspective, while the standpoint of the oppressed might offer a more adequate and, in that sense, more objective picture of social reality. This is not a free-floating kind of argument, as I said, but it's grounded in a specific historical and sociological analysis, and it can in particular refer to two factors that enable such standpoint theoretical relative epistemic privileges. On the one hand, what I just emphasized, namely the practical necessity of these agents to navigate existing power relations. That's the same as with the stranger in Simmel's case, but also what with critical theory we could call the kind of emancipatory interest in overcoming the status quo, which is another reason for developing these alternative epistemologies. Final slide and wrapping up. So I think these perspectives can help us see how critical theory can anchor its perspective in social reality. It's not about uncritically just attaching yourself to a particular standpoint, but mobilizing the epistemic resources that are there. This can also serve as a counterweight to the tendency of many critical theories also today to have a kind of more disempowering and asymmetric relation to practice that denies ordinary agents sort of participation in the practice of critique and resistance and also knowledge production. And it helps, I think, spell out what it would mean to see critical theory itself as a practice and recognizing its addressees not just as objects of the analysis, but as potential partners in a dialogical struggle. Horkheimer himself, I think, and I forgot to put his name under the last quote, that's a quote from Max Horkheimer, I think saw this quite clearly when he talked about the relation between critical theory and practice in terms of a dynamic unity, which acknowledges the ever-present possibility of tension between the theoretician and the class, or we might add the struggle, the movement, the experience, which his thinking is supposed to serve. So there is the link, yes, but it's a link that always needs to be thought of in a dynamic and not in a one-dimensional or unidirectional way. Okay, maybe that's enough as an introduction for our discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robin. We really appreciate that you be here with us. We know that in Germany it's late, so thank you again. And maybe now we can start, as Robin said, with a discussion. Tal vez ahora podemos empezar, si les parece, con preguntas y comentarios que quieren hacer. No sé si te gustaría empezar a vos, Agustín, con...
Sí, Thank you very much, Robin, for your presentation. So in our seminar, we had studied and discussed a lot of perspectives within critical theory, from Habermas to your work. And in the middle, we have discussed also the perspectives of Judith Butler, Axel Honneth, and so weiter. But my question is about this relation between the perspective of epistemology and the perspective of, one can say, philosophical normativity. So my question is, which is the difference between your perspective on alternative epistemologies and maybe the approach of other perspectives of critical theory, which are interested in the question of the normative foundation of critique? And my question is, because I think that both perspectives try to answer the question of the relationship between theory and praxis, or practice, which is the name of Habermas, the young Habermas book. And I think that maybe there are both questions are trying to answer this problem. So my question will be that why do you emphasize so much the distinction between the question on normative foundation of critique and the perspective of this new epistemology, or this plural perspective of epistemology?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, which is really an important one, I think. I mean, so the starting point for me here is in a way something that Axel Honneth has always emphasized, namely that if critical theory is supposed to be a distinct theoretical paradigm or a distinct tradition, it has to be able to differentiate itself from let's say mainstream normative political philosophy, for example, right? Not that there's something wrong with normative philosophy, but if critical theory is supposed to be something specific and not just not just a subset of normative political philosophy, then we have to spell out what that specificity consists in. And I think there are two ways to do that. I mean, one is to say, well, it's in the Marxist tradition, it's an interdisciplinary kind of materialist project in which philosophy does play a role, but also social science and more empirical knowledge plays a role. So it's something like non-ideal theory plus social theory, to use these terms. But the other point that Axel Honneth has emphasized is that it has to somehow be anchored in practice. So that's for him, that means it has to be in a form of immanent or reconstructive critique, which doesn't mean it's not normative, but it means that the normativity has a different status than some of the other philosophical approaches that are around. And now I think there's still different ways of understanding that project, obviously, right? There are different ways of spelling that out. From my point of view, the way in which Honneth, for example, proceeds is still too normative in a specific way, because it. So there are a couple of problems. I mean, one is that in the end, the relation to struggle is not entirely clear to me in his case. I mean, obviously in the early work there's a strong reference to struggles. In the later work it becomes more historicist and more institution centered, which I think is, let's say, is a problem for a critical theory that in a sense started by claiming we have to anchor the theorizing in struggles and movements. But also the normativity becomes more free-floating, as it were. And I'm just let's say skeptical, but this is just a matter of methodological maybe different preferences, that you can spell out these normative questions in a way that is ultimately convincing. I don't know what specifically would enable the critical theorist to do that kind of normative work. So my strategy, in a way, is to minimize the normative commitments, and to because I think they can be problematic for a variety of reasons. Also because it might enable the critical theorist to then take a kind of position of superiority with regard to practice or ordinary agents, so that there's a potential problem there. But more specifically speaking, I think that the virtue in minimizing normativity is that you don't put the critical theorist in the position of saying how society should be organized, or of how people should lead their lives. And again, why is that important? Well, I think that's important because the whole, let's say, vocabulary and theoretical apparatus of critical theory is actually not very well equipped to give us an answer to that. So if you look at some of the core concepts of critical theory, ideology, alienation, structural domination, and so on, what I think is specific for them, and that's I think where I agree with Rahel Yegi, is that these are second order concepts, right? If you talk about ideology, well, that is in a way an injustice, but it's primarily something that blocks people from really addressing injustice, right? So it's a second order phenomenon. It makes something else impossible. That's why it's problematic. The same for alienation. Alienation means that people are not in the position to answer certain questions themselves. And that's why it's a second order problem, as it were. And in that sense, I think the critical theory is specifically well equipped to address these second order obstacles. But if that is the case, it doesn't need a lot of normativity. Basically, it just needs to say, well, people should themselves be in a position to think about and collectively decide how to organize their lives. The critical theorist is not in a position to tell them how to do that. And if the critical theorist does that, as Marcuse, for example, did, it's kind of problematic. That's also where in the book I see the main connection with psychoanalysis. At least in some of his writings, Freud is very careful to say, I, as a therapist, my job is not to tell you how to live. It's not to answer the first order questions for you. It's to put you in a position to answer them for yourself. And I think that's also a good description in a way of the task of critical theory. The critical theorist is not there to tell how society is supposed to be organized, what a just society would look like. He or she is there to somehow analyze the obstacles that prevent society from addressing these questions, be they ideological or forms of structural domination, etc. And I think that's what I think is interesting about also some of the work. And one example that I like to give in this respect is the difference between Marcuse's and Nancy Fraser's critique of the category of needs or false needs. Yeah. So there's the kind of old tradition that needs can be false, right? When people walk around today and they think they need the new iPhone, it's a kind of example for a false need. It's induced by the culture industry, PR machinery of Apple, etc. They don't really need it, obviously, even if they think they do. And Marcuse has a kind of substantialist critique of false needs, a kind of first order critique. He says, well, these needs are false because I know, in terms of my understanding of human nature, these are the real needs, right? And I think Nancy Fraser, in some of her articles from the 90s, she makes a very good point by saying, well, it's actually pretty difficult to make the distinction between true and false needs on a substantial basis, because you need a kind of view of human nature, and we know that. I mean, you mentioned Butler and others. I mean, we know that that's not uncontested, right? But you can still make that distinction based on a more, let's say, procedural or second order perspective by analyzing the discourses and practices in which people are able or not able to articulate their needs, to come to a shared understanding of what their needs are, etc. And so again, Fraser identifies the kind of obstacles to that process as what leads to the distortion of needs, but not the kind of alienation from true human nature. So yeah, I hope this clarifies a bit of why I think I don't think that that alternative approach that I try to sketch, that I don't think it's non-normative. I just think it's less normative, let's say. Yeah, and I think that maybe helps in understanding what specifically critical theory can bring to the table.
Okay, that's very insightful. Thank you, Robin.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Robin. I would like to recommend you. I mean, in a book that was published recently, Recognition and Ambivalence. There is a contribution from Robin that is entitled Beyond Needs, and Robin covered these topics. I have been talking about this article of yours in the seminar, so thank you very much. It was very interesting. Ahora yo en mi pregunta voy a tratar de tocar dos temas que Robin tocó, o de los que habló en su presentación, cuando habló de las asimetrías epistémicas y la intención de reorientar a la teoría crítica. So, Robin, I would like to touch two specific topics that you have covered in your presentation when you talk about the epistemic asymmetries, and finally when you talk about the intention of reorienting critical theory. So I think that in last years, critical theory, the project of a critical theory of society, has been experiencing a process of increasing globalization and even, why not, peripheralization in a way. So, for instance, the project of the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs, the journal Critical Times that you well know, your own work, of course, and interventions from people like Amy Allen, which are pointing towards a decolonization of the normative foundation of mainstream German critical theory, are in a way signs of a situation according to which the concept of a critical theory is expanding and obtaining a broader and more complex sense. I think also that the fact that the current director of the Institute of Frankfurt is someone like Stefan Lesenich, who is especially concerned about the worldwide relations of dependency and exploitation, is a sign of all this. So first of all, I would like to know if you agreed with this diagnosis, and what are your opinions and thoughts on the matter. Secondly, and more specifically, I would like to ask you, which are for you the main tasks? In a way, you have talked about this, but which are for you the main tasks that a global critical theory, a complex and a broader critical theory, I mean, has to develop in order to give an account not only of core or centric realities like the European or northern ones, but also of peripheral realities like those of the Latin American countries that we, of course, well know. So that will be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Santiago. These are very important and also complex questions, of course. I mean, so first, I think I agree with your diagnosis that there's an increasing sense that critical theory needs to catch up. Let's say that it has to move out of the very narrow perspectives that have informed it. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's different things that are problematic in different authors, etc. But I think in general, and we can see that I think in the work of Axel Honneth quite clearly, there is still, not just a kind of Eurocentrism, a kind of concentration on a historically quite specific type of society in a way that overgeneralizes maybe what can be said about social development on that basis. But there's also still what in sociology is sometimes called the container model of society. So, that societies are treated as these entities that are somehow there, independent from other societies, and that we can theorize in terms of their normative structures or grammars as if they are closed containers in a way, rather than embedded in a kind of global structure, both historically and also in contemporary terms. And I think this lack of attention to the embeddedness of the societies that critical theory has concentrated on, so let's say Western European societies primarily, this shows itself in a couple of lacunas that are now increasingly becoming obvious and that people have started to work on. I mean, one is what you mentioned, right? So Amy L., Eduardo Mendieta, and some others have drawn attention to, the importance of colonialism for the historical development of the societies in question, and that colonialism is not just, an enabling condition for the the development of the modern capitalist economy, but that it has also epistemologically shaped some of the assumptions in terms of progress, in terms of the distinction between modern and non-modern societies that are still quite central to a lot of critical theory production today. But there's also two, I think, other aspects that play a role here. One is that that until recently, and Shayla Ben-Habib has been one of the very few exceptions, migration hasn't really played any role in critical theory, and that goes both ways. I mean, it hasn't played a role as something that has, so shaped the global constellation, and without which, for example, also the societies in Latin America are not really possible to understand. But also something that has profoundly changed the societies in Europe and in Germany and other places, which only sort of very recently come reluctantly to the realization that they are what is sometimes called migration societies that are fundamentally shaped by migration. For some time this has been debated under the label of multiculturalism, but that has also had its limitations. This raises a lot of issues, not just in critical political theory about democracy, the borders of democracy, how to think about borders, etc. But it also raises questions in social theory in terms of for example, how solidarity has to be rethought in a society in which some of the assumptions about homogeneity that also are still there in Axel Honneth's work do not seem to apply anymore, do not seem to map social reality. And the final example that I want to mention, simply because I was the last 2 days, also today, in a workshop about theories of racism in Germany, is that this has been more or less completely absent from German critical theory discussions. I mean, I'm sure that you're aware that the theory and critique of anti-Semitism has played an important role for the first generation of critical theorists, less so later. But there's very little analysis of racism in critical theory, and that's for a variety of reasons. I think one has to do with the kind of sort of idealizing self-image of European societies that you find in some of these theories. Part of it has to do with the identification of racism with National Socialism, so that it seemed a phenomenon of the past and not something that is still there, as it were. I think that's where it's really important that critical theory also opens up and takes on board the theoretical perspective of other paradigms, such as critical philosophy of race or critical race theory, as I mentioned. Just as Nancy Fraser in the late 1980s had to point out that, well, if Marx's understanding of critical theory as the self-clarification of the social struggles of the age is correct, then how come that critical theorists had nothing to say about feminism and the women's struggle, right? So she wrote this article, What's Critical About Critical Theory, and said, well, if critical theory wants to be critical, it better pay attention to the struggles of the age, right? So why didn't Habermas or Honneth pay any attention to that? Well, that has changed, but I think you can ask the same question today. Why shouldn't we pay attention, for example, to anti-racist movements or global justice movements that problematize forms of exclusion and forms of global asymmetries that seem quite relevant from a critical perspective, but that haven't played a big role in critical theory. So I think this is slowly changing, but it's quite slow. I think there's also a generational shift to a certain extent. I think especially if you look at younger people doing critical theory, also in Germany, also in Europe, they are much more aware of these issues and interested in them and try to bring them into the discussion. And I think there's also an attempt to create more, forums to have that conversation or to have those exchanges. But it's also something that I think, is still quite challenging and marked itself by a lot of asymmetries, because, and that's an experience I had quite often when I, visited South America, or also when I went to East Asia, that usually people are very well informed about, as in your group, you read everything from Honneth and Yegi and myself, etc. All these discussions, but there's very little knowledge on the European side of the discussions in South America or in East Asia. Partly it's a language problem, but not only, because obviously quite a lot of people publish in English nowadays. So there's other factors at play here as well. So yeah, so I think partly it's a problem having to do with with theory itself. Partly it is a problem having to do with the global asymmetries in knowledge production and knowledge circulation. So yeah, maybe that's the first answer I can give to this question. I think there's a reorientation happening, but it's also still at the beginning.
Great, thank you very much, Robin. Very interesting. Si les parece, no sé si Agustín, vos querés comentar algo más o.
We have just half an hour, so maybe I have another question, but maybe if any student wanted to make a...
Si tal vez alguien quiere hacer algún comentario o alguna pregunta, sería como el momento indicado. Recuerden que pueden hacerla perfectamente en castellano. Robin va a hacer el esfuerzo por entender, justamente para romper tal vez incluso estas asimetrías. ¿No? Un gesto en ese sentido, así que...
In the meanwhile, Robin, I would like to make another question about the relation between your theory of social science and positive knowledge of sociology, for example, on and contemporary diagnosis on our present. So there is a tendency in Europe, United States, and also in Latin America. I think it's a tendency in all over the world. The so-called phenomenon of the new authoritarianism and the new challenges to fundamental human rights and democracies. So my question is, how does a post-pragmatist critical theory approach to the political and social growth of right-wing radicalism in contemporary societies? And my question is about this interesting notion of the relation between the experience of suffering or injustice and the relationship between these experiences in social actors and the actual translation of this experience in a language or in a narrative. There is no automatism. So maybe can you tell something about this moment and how the capacities and the faculties of judgment and criticism of social actors are motive of different challenges from different narratives and ideologies, what one can say, which are anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic, and and they are growing politically, and so yeah, that will be my question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I have to put off the camera for a moment. I'm at home alone with my daughter, and I have to at the same time attend to her. But I listened to the question. Problem. I can respond to it. No worries. Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I mean, in a way, I shift. Let's say I shift registers a bit in thinking about right-wing populism and the new authoritarianism. It's actually more difficult to do that on the basis of, let's say, emphasizing the critical capacities of ordinary people. There's a different strand in critical theory that I refer to there, because I think what is quite interesting is that in the early Frankfurt School, you find obviously the analysis of authoritarianism in Adorno and in other authors. Löwenthal would be another author here. And I think what makes them interesting for the contemporary debate is that they don't understand right-wing populism or authoritarianism only as a matter of the substantial political aims of these movements, right? But also in terms of the, let's say, the political form and the political dynamic that these movements unfold. So let me just maybe clarify that a bit. I mean, so, what can we learn from critical theory for the analysis of this kind of right-wing populism? I think there are two or three things. I mean, first, in terms of the content, you can just have a kind of liberal critique of the content. Say, well, many of the aims of these movements are just incompatible with liberal democratic values. Okay, so that's clear, and I think that critique has to be made. But it's also one that critical theory again doesn't necessarily contribute much to. It's sort of something that liberal political theory can do quite well. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that in terms of an analysis of critical theory, we can. So I know that this is a bit different in South America, where populism has a different connotation, let's say. But in terms of the European situation, I think we have to be quite careful of equating right-wing and left-wing populism too quickly, right? I mean, that's why actually I'm a bit reluctant to use the label of populism, even because it suggests that there is a common structure on the left and on the right, which is populist, and then they just use populism on the one hand for a left-wing project and on the other hand for a right-wing project, which I don't think is very helpful, because the differences are quite big, both on the level of content, which I think is clear, but also on the level of form, or organizational form, and even of, I would say, the underlying social diagnosis and the dynamics that follows from it. So again, that's, I think, where critical theory becomes irrelevant, actually, because if you look at the diagnosis, I mean, the right-wing populist movements often start from a diagnosis that is characterized by partly real and partly imaginary factors. So, for example, in the US, a lot of Trump voters would think that white people are now the most sort of discriminated against group in the US, right? Now that's a belief that is not compatible with the empirical evidence, right? So it starts, the diagnosis is one that can be criticized. But also it's just a different effective logic, let's say. If your anger, as in the case of a lot of right-wing movements, comes from the fear that you lose a position of dominance, that's a very different anger than the anger at being actually excluded or being oppressed. So what I want to say here is that, and that's something that Adorno, for example, in his analysis of fascism saw very well, right? I mean, it's not to say that he points out that there's a very important, let's say, phantasmatic dimension to it. It's not necessarily that the most oppressed or excluded vote for right-wing populist movements. It's primarily middle classes who anticipate or fear that they will lose their position. However justified that fear is, that's a different question. So that's another interesting thing, I think, that Adorno points out very early in his analysis, and that we should keep in mind, let's say, for an analysis of contemporary authoritarian movements. And the third one is that let's say, right-wing populism or the new authoritarianism is always it's triadic. It's not just the people against the elites, but it's always at least in Europe, right? I mean, it's always the people against the elites and against the foreigners, or those who the elites are somehow in coalition with against the ordinary people. And that's again something that Adorno saw very well. I think that there's this personalization of a structural problem and the scapegoating of a particular group. So again, that's also something that Löwenthal points out in this book, False Prophets, where he says, it's like there is some kernel of truth there. The economic situation is really bad, social inequality is rising, etc. But then that kernel of truth gets completely lost in the kind of pseudo solution that the authoritarians or the populists present, because that solution is, just get rid of this group and then everything will be fine, which is obviously not going to work, right? I mean, you will not solve the effects of neoliberal restructuring by having less foreigners in the country. Just as Johnson now has to realize that having Brexit is not going to solve the problems that neoliberal policies in the UK affected. So on these different levels, I think critical theory can contribute something to both critically discussing the diagnosis that underlies different right-wing populist authoritarian reaction, the ways in which these political movements are organized. So, for example, many of them are organized a kind of homogeneous identity formation, clear hierarchical structures, identification with the leader. That was very clear in the Trump case, for example, which is not so much the case in left-wing movements, but also the effects that the suggested solution has, right? Namely, for example, is it a personalized solution or pseudo solution to a structural problem, or is there really some, is there really something that could help address the structural problems that are undeniably there? So, these are some of the points that I think critical theory could bring to the table. The question of the kind of pragmatism in my approach, or the kind of taking ordinary agents seriously, becomes more complicated, obviously. I must say that I have less optimistic days when I think, well, sometimes ordinary agents are really not such a good reference point for critical theory, and you have to, revert to the more objective and science-based position, maybe, that you also referred to. But at the same time, I still think that at least for a part of those who support these movements, you have to have somehow the hope or the ambition that if you would, confront them with these analyses of what is going on, that they might still be turned around and sort of see that they have been, to a certain extent, also misled. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that many of these movements, they are also very well funded, and there's a very strong economic interests behind them. So they have an interest in, misleading to a certain extent. I mean, it's propaganda what is happening there, right? It's an information warfare. They have a certain interest in misleading people to think that, if they vote for X, Y, or Z, their lives will get better. And usually they don't as a result. And then, the populist leader disappears or another one comes up. So I'm not sure that really spoke to the main concern of your question, but that's, how I would see the relation between critical theory and sort of the new authoritarianism today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bueno, nos quedan unos minutos, así que nos gustaría también poder tener la oportunidad de que
una pregunta más. Tenemos tiempo si se anima.
¿Algún comentario, alguna inquietud sobre el trabajo de Robin o la teoría crítica en general?
Yes, Robin, beg your pardon for my English. Just 2 words I would like to ask you. You talk about a less normative perspective, but normative at least. I would like to know which aspects are central for you on your normative consumption or standpoint on justice.
Yeah, thank you. So the normative core for me is this idea that critical. Sorry, I don't know why she's now having a cuss here. The normative core is this idea of the exercise of critical capacities and of having the ability to, leading a life that is informed by one's own reflexive. Taking a critical distance and reflecting on one's own position and what one is doing, and the way in which collective life should be organized. Now that I think is something that it's a certain idea of autonomy. Yeah, but I don't think it's a very substantial idea of autonomy. I think it's let's turn off. Okay, sorry, I turn off the camera so she won't bother you too much.
Yes, no problem.
it's a certain idea of autonomy that is, I would say not fully blown kind of Kantian autonomy, but rather something more along the lines of what Freud had in mind in a more procedural or relational understanding of autonomy. So, or what you could also see that in Adorno's idea of Mündigkeit, of being mature. I mean, Mündigkeit is this is still, autonomy is still in the process of being developed here. It's she was very well asleep, and I thought that it wouldn't be a problem, but as it happens. Yeah, so that would be my response. The critical or the normative core is a certain idea of Mündigkeit, of relative or contextual or relational autonomy, of the exercise of critical and reflective capacities, and the ability of agents to answer the question of how they want to live, both individually and collectively, themselves. Yeah, I'm afraid that's all I can say at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, the Spanish translation of Mündigkeit is mayoría de edad. No.
Yes.
Well, we can see that you are dealing right now with your daughter, no problem. So maybe we can finish the conversation here.
It's a good idea. We have left just 7 minutes. So
yeah.
Rob, thank you very much for being with us. Well,
yeah, well, sorry that it was such a bumpy start first technically, and now now in terms
you're experiencing another kind of technical problems, but it's okay.
Yes, indeed, a problem of
being a father. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I mean, it's 10:30 p.m. here, and I didn't have another, because my wife is working in another city, so it was difficult to organize things. But I was, she seemed to be very well asleep, so I was thinking it would work, but it worked part-time at least.
Okay, so we really appreciate that you take this time to talking with us, and I don't know, thank you. I think that everyone here is grateful for having this time with us. So thank you very much, Robin, and I hope we can see us in the future, in the near future at least.
Yes, I hope so as well. And well, thanks for the invitation and for your interest in my work. I hope it was useful. And Santiago, thanks for the book. I'm excited to see the conversation there. Yeah. And yes, let's stay in touch. And I hope one day I can come back to Buenos Aires.
Great. Yes, I owe you a physical copy of the book. Probably in the next weeks we're going to have the physical copy, and I will send you one. So thank you very much. Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Bueno, y nos estamos viendo.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Cheers.
Chao. Adiós y nos vemos pronto.
Gracias. Chao.
Seguramente esto